Recording in progress.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from, and welcome to another session of the Global Markets with Jim Fitzpatrick. Today, we want to discuss a very important topic of the cashew industry. We want to look at cashew demands, and Jim will be leading us in this discussion. But before then, we want to remind you that this session is live in English and French. You can choose your preferred language by clicking on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen and muting your original sound. We also want to let you know that you can be part of this interaction by sending your questions and comments in the Q&A box. Before I hand over to Jim, I would like to remind all of you that the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo, which will take place from 15th to 18th September 2026 in Accra, Ghana, registration is already ongoing. You can visit the ACA website now, www.africancashewalliance.com, to register. Also to say thank you to our proud sponsors and partners, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the Cashew Club, and the GIZ Move Cashew. Good morning, Jim. How are you doing?
I'm great. Good to hear you. Good morning to you. Welcome, everyone. We're going to talk about demand. We're going to talk about long-term prospects for demand. And we're going to talk a little bit about the theme of cashews at the crossroads. This is continuing the theme of the last two events. You might remember we talked about supply, we talked about the future of supply, we talked about the balance between supply and demand. And today I want to have a look at the longer term prospects for demand and where that might lead us in terms of that supply and demand balance. But we'll start, as always, with a quick look at the markets, what we're seeing in the markets, a little bit of a focus on Africa. Crop estimates, well, according to us, crops are getting bigger. They're not really getting bigger. They were always that big, but we didn't know it. We're seeing higher crop estimates now from Cambodia and from Cote d'Ivoire, and that's changing the situation. We're also seeing a relatively positive harvest in the last crop region of the world, Senegal and Guinea-Bissau in particular, and the results there are looking more and more positive. Farmgate prices have fallen. They've fallen in most countries because the quality falls towards the end of the season. So that would apply from Nigeria all the way around to Burkina Faso, maybe Guinea too, not so much in Guinea-Bissau or in Senegal. The grown-up prices remain steady and, somewhat surprisingly steady. Costs are higher. Is it freight? Freight's certainly a factor. Or is it the strength of traders? And I think that too is a factor, keeping raw nut prices pretty steady. We'll have a look at the imports in a few minutes. Kernels prices, steady or steady-ish, as we might say here. It's market goes up and down. It's in a narrow range. I don't think there's any sign of a big breakout either way at the moment. Costs on the one hand, reasonable demand on the other. At the same time, there are challenges for demand this year, mostly due to the economic impact of the war. Large nuts, a lot of chat about large nuts, a lot of chat about the premiums for large nuts, and that's true. It's not really justified by the supply. If you look at Cambodia supplying perhaps 700,000 tons of large nuts out of 1 million that they're going to supply, And there are certainly more offers of this at the moment. So maybe the talk about large nuts is more about we have them to sell than we're actually making these big premium prices. But there is certainly a taste for the larger nuts in China, for example. Demand is stable in the West. It's not particularly good news one way or the other in the West, but it is slow in the East, and it looks like markets like India are more badly affected by the impact, the economic impact of the war in the Gulf, the war on Iran. And that war is, well, is it coming to an end? It seems to be, fortunately, but I think the economic impact will last for some time. The war may stop, but the economic impact, the shock in a way of higher oil prices for those 2.5 months is going to have a longer term impact, particularly, I think, on consumer thinking. The way consumers look at things this summer in Europe will be different because of this, probably the same in the United States. People will be concerned, particularly as we get to the end of this summer in the Northern Hemisphere, that their energy bills in the winter will be higher. And this mismatch between kernels and raw cashew nuts, we talked about this a couple of sessions ago. No parity, no sweat was the name of that one, if you remember, and that continues. Now, that could be cost-driven. That could signal that kernels prices should be higher, but for them to go higher, you need buyers. You need stronger demand. So I think that mismatch is likely to continue for some time, and that's going to tighten margins for processors. It's not an easy year for processors already. Margins are going to be very tight, especially for processors in Vietnam. So let's have a look at supply. We'll have a quick update on supply, and we'll focus on the main producing countries as usual. So starting in Asia, I was in Cambodia last week. Great strides in the cashew sector in Cambodia. Exports this year up 11% by the end of May. That probably doesn't reflect the crop. The exports last year were a little bit later than they normally would be. Nonetheless, 965,000 tons exported. The season is coming to an end. People, and this is discussion rather than statistics, but people talk about something like 100,000 tons left in the country. That's between the processors, a small amount of speculative inventories in the warehouses, as we usually get. You will see imports into Vietnam from Cambodia as the season goes on, but the holders of those nuts are asking big prices, well up towards $2,000 a ton. I doubt if they'll reach those levels, but that's what they're asking, and they're determined to hold on to see if they can get higher prices. Crop will definitely reach 1 million tons, with 965 already shipped out by the end of May, with 100,000 tons in stock. Well, you can do the sums. Production longer term seems set to grow. It's not going to grow at the levels of the last 5 years, but it does look likely to continue to grow in the coming years. It looks very likely that Cambodia will reach somewhere around the region where Côte d'Ivoire is today, up around the 1.5 million tons. It'll take time. That's assuming that there's no shock in demand or no shock from climate change. But looking at the way things are, production will continue to grow. And of course, we're up over 1 million tons already. So we're now talking big numbers. So small percentage growth results in a big change in the overall production. And this is having an impact. It's very important for Vietnamese processors, and it's very important for Cambodia, which is trying to develop a value-added industry, better post-harvest handling, and an ecosystem to build a cashew industry. And that'll be interesting to see. I think it's going to happen. It'll be interesting to see how it happens over the next 5 to 10 years. What about India? Well, the crop forecast, and this is really based on the weather rather than any official forecasts, but the crop forecast looks a little bit better, I think. Imports are strong. Imports up by 41% to the end of April. April is the last official figures that we have. Really strong start. January and February, most of this increase was in January and February. April was a little bit lower. I think April was 56,000 tons versus 83 in 2025. And that might reflect the weaker rupee. It probably reflects some of the economic pressures. But if we look at the imports, very strong January, very strong February, a little bit softer during March and April, and that's kind of what you would expect. I'm estimating that May will come close to last year, but we won't know that for a little while yet. Generally speaking, good supply outlook in Cambodia, reasonably good supply outlook in India too. What about the biggest player in the world in processing, Vietnam? We have a look at their supply situation. So this is as of the 15th of June. Vietnamese stats come out promptly. And this is what they're telling us. They're telling us, first of all, that imports of raw cashew nuts are up by 11%, which is impressive, particularly in this season. That exports are up by 5%, which is also impressive. Now, that's represented by a recovery in the United States, offset by a decline in the Middle East. The Middle Eastern demand, the Ramadan demand, for example, it's not going to come back. That's not the way the type of cashew demand that we have there works. It's highly festival oriented, and if it's lost for the year. But looking at that situation in Vietnam, there's about 3.7 months of stock. So if Vietnam was to export the same volume every month for the next 4 months, the current inventory will be about 3.7 months stock. Now that doesn't include two things to note. It doesn't include any stock that may be in transit in Vietnam at the moment. That's in warehouses, not custom cleared. And the estimate of a float, so I have estimated 150,000 tons of float. That could be higher, it could be a little bit lower. Generally speaking, we're in or around about 4 months of stock. No big problem in Vietnam then in terms of supply, but reluctance from buyers. And who can blame them given the prices of the raw cashew nuts compared to the current cashew kernels market? If we have a look at the imports from African countries, there's been a lot of chat online. There's a lot of AI generated, I don't know, I don't want to be too harsh, but there's a lot of AI generated inaccurate stuff online these days. If we look at January to May imports to Vietnam from the 4 major African suppliers, what we can see is that imports from those top 4 are actually up by 7%. Now, you wouldn't believe that if you were thinking about the exports and the sales side from Cote d'Ivoire, for example, or even perhaps from Nigeria. And you can see that big increase on last year in Cote d'Ivoire. It gets back to the levels of 2024. So 2026, up around 107,000 tons, according to the Vietnamese Customs Authority. And that's well up. That's, you're getting on for double last year, back to the levels of 2024. Tanzania too, more and more Vietnamese buyers are interested in Tanzanian raw cashew nuts for various reasons. First of all, there are a lot more of them available now than there were 2 years ago. And secondly, the quality of the Tanzanian raw cashew nuts. Now, the big step up was 2024 into 2025, but in 2026, it has stepped up again. So we're talking about the crop that was harvested in Tanzania between September and December, roughly. And that has impacted imports in Vietnam. So imports up 11%. Imports from the top 4 African countries up 7%. If Ivorian raw cashew nuts are arriving in January and February, it probably means that they were either already in Vietnam in transit or that they were old crop material. That would tend to suggest that there's more left to be delivered from Cote d'Ivoire than you might think. Usually the purchase volume is between 700 and 800,000 tons. It may not reach that this year, but the volume is there. The volume is available. not really any difficulty in Vietnam on supply right now. The problem is the price of raw cashew nuts. If you want to buy them, you're going to pay a high price compared to kernels. What about Africa? Let's look at the central region. We're talking about Côte d'Ivoire, the world's largest producer, and Burkina Faso. Côte d'Ivoire season ending. It's all slowing down now, but it's still going on and will continue into July. That means that it's a much longer, much slower season than normal. But it also means that the volumes are likely to be higher than would have been expected back in February, March time. Quality, of course, declines. It's raining at this time of year. It rains throughout the harvest, really, and that causes quality to decline. This year was not a great year for quality anyway. Processors say, or CCIK says, the processors have bought 650,000 tons. Will they process it all? Who knows? I think some of it might come back into the RCN market. The CCIK, that's the regulatory body, used to be known as the CCI, they tell us that 1.3 million tons has been commercialized. Now, if we take 1.3 million tons that's already been commercialized, some old crop was lying around, take that off, add on some smuggling, add on what's been happening in June and what will happen in the early part of July. That could be a crop approaching 1.4 million tons. That's not far off last year's 1.55 million tons, and it's a much bigger crop than it was originally forecast. So we really need to be careful when we look at some of the forecasts. I think our lowest forecast was 1.3, but some people were down below 1 million tons. Now, a lot of that is propaganda. A lot of it is meant to help sell raw cashew nuts. Be cautious when you listen to the numbers from any producing country. Burkina Faso, less of a story really. It's exports continue now. Processors seem to have bought what they need. The system appears to have worked for processors. They probably paid more than they expected to this year. I think they will be under a certain amount of pressure, profitability pressure. I think the general situation is difficult in Burkina Faso for processors, although the processing capacity has been increasing. Interesting times ahead. Elsewhere, so let's move back further east to Nigeria. We started with the crop estimate from Nigeria of 280,000 tons, they told us. Now we could easily justify an estimate of 320,000 tons, plus the imports from Benin. That means Nigeria could handle about 400,000 tons of raw cashew nuts this year. That's not far off a record. The impact of the smuggled nuts from Benin, the impact of the ban on exports from Benin is really being felt in Nigeria this year. There are some interesting discussions upcoming on policy and policy development in Nigeria. I think this will be the last season where we'll have a fully free market. Next year, we're going to see some form of intervention, although that needs to be still agreed and implemented. And as we know from cashew policies across West Africa, the difficulty is always in the implementation. In Ghana, season over basically. I still think the crop's about 150,000 tons. We always thought it was around about that. Definitely much lower quality this year. Processors under pressure. I think probably they bought less this year. There's not that many of them, of course, but I think those that are there have bought less this year than they certainly would have planned, and possibly even less than they bought last year. Sector in Ghana is not in an easy position. There is a lot of talk. A Cashew Council of Ghana has been established, I understand, and there's a lot of discussion about policy and regulation. But that's nothing new. There's been a lot of discussion about policy and regulation. There's been a lot of consultants involved. There's been a lot of changes in organizations over the past 5 years. And you know what, I'll be honest about it. I think the only happy people are the consultants. It's not really worked so far. Benin processors say that they've bought about 80,000 tons. That's 45% of the crop. That starts to become impressive. It's not the capacity. It's about 60% of the capacity in the country, but it is an improvement if correct. And we don't know for sure if that's correct because we're adding up numbers from various processors' estimates. Crop probably a little bit lower this year. We think 170 to 180,000 tons. Very difficult to tell because of the illegal export flows. That means that we're not ever going to be absolutely sure what the crop was this year in Benin. But generally speaking, we think it was a little bit lower. And finally, then to further west in Senegal, that crop, so Senegal grows about 55,000 tons of cashews in a normal year. It is growing. We would expect it to increase from this year. We would have expected it to increase from this year. Possibly the weather is not as good. Again, you've got this border trade between Guinea-Bissau and Senegal, which makes it really difficult to measure what's growing where. That trade is less this year. So in fact, maybe we're not looking at a lower crop. Maybe we're just looking at less cross-border trade. But we are certainly looking at an export tax, and we're looking at more government involvement. Ambition in Senegal is high to process the crop. Reality is that that isn't happening yet. And so to Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau estimate has increased. This definitely looks better. 300,000 tons. I think this is as good a crop as we're going to get there. Trading is opened. They're telling us 150,000 tons has been commercialized. That's probably more by now. That's about 10 days ago. Quality very good. Farm gate prices a little bit higher because it's the normal crop. It's good quality. That's contrary to the trends elsewhere where farm gate prices have been slipping a little bit. All of this information, or a good share of it, let's say, thanks to the ACA Afri-Cashew splits, where reporters in each country talk to stakeholders, gather information, and give us reports. And finally, the last country that we look at is Guinea. Not much change to report. Crop still estimated around 150,000 tons. I'm a little bit surprised by that number, but we go with it. We have it from pretty good sources. Quality is lower, and that doesn't appear to be an issue of growing. It appears to be an issue of post-harvest, and probably the result of anxiety on the part of farmers to move product quickly after a slightly late harvest. You know, they say finance drives business, and in this case, from farm gate all the way through to processors in West Africa, the availability or lack of availability of cash or working capital is a real determinant of how the market works. So overall, production looks better. Now, it's mostly driven by an increase in the estimates of the volume from Cambodia and Cote d'Ivoire. We've put our estimates, we do a high and low, as you know if you've been on this webinar before. We've put our high estimate up by 3% and our low estimate up by 2%. That's based on higher production in Cote d'Ivoire, slightly higher production than expected in Cambodia, a better crop in Guinea-Bissau. That's not particularly good news, but it is good news. And then an increase in the estimate from Tanzania. So for this purpose, we're talking about the Tanzanian crop that was harvested September to December. Much bigger volume than we might have been expecting in February, March time. But lower quality will have an impact, and there is definitely lower quality in parts of West Africa. I wouldn't have expected to be saying this from what I was listening to in February, but 2026 may actually be the largest crop in history. More likely, it's the second largest crop in history. Last year was the largest, but of course, it's not the best quality. And someone asked a valid question last webinar: how does the quality impact the overall availability? And I think we were talking about, we estimated an impact of about 4% in those countries affected. So overall availability of kernels is less than the availability in a normal year because of lower quality. That's not the case in Vietnam, Cambodia, India. It's not the case in Tanzania or Mozambique. It's not the case in Guinea-Bissau. So the actual impact is relatively modest. It's a much bigger crop than people thought. So what can we draw from these market factors? We know the crop is better than expected. It's been a long harvest. It continues. Estimates were understated at the beginning, particularly the trade estimates. So you had this strange situation. If you think back to February and March, when we really first started talking seriously about crop estimates. And at that time, what we saw was high estimates from official sources in most countries and low estimates from trade sources. Well, as we used to say as traders, everyone is talking their own book. Everyone is talking the numbers the way they think best suits their purposes, their objectives. To a large extent, unfortunately, it's probably the case that the traders, the exporters were talking the crop down in order to make higher prices for raw cashew nuts, and the official bodies were talking the crop up in order to reflect their own achievement of goals. And you know what? They weren't far wrong. At the end of the day, the crop was bigger than the traders were telling us. What else? Well, it looks to me now as if inventories and imports in India and Vietnam are adequate to keep going. That doesn't mean that they don't need to buy. Of course they do. But it does mean that there's no panic. I saw someone writing about a technical squeeze this morning on, I think it was on LinkedIn. I don't know where people get these ideas from, but there's no real indication of that. And if it were to happen, it wouldn't happen till the end of the year. Oh, and by the way, the end of the year, well, it's coming towards July. We're only 2 months away from the harvest in East Africa. It's only 2 months away by the time we get to the end of this month. In Tanzania, they're forecasting a bigger crop again. They've had some healthy rains for production. I think we could see. So the official estimate of this year was 617,000 tons. This is going to hit 700,000 tons at some point. Could it be 2026, 27? Yeah, it could. We'll see. But we shouldn't be thinking that supply is getting particularly tight right now. I mean, that's just the reality. Yeah, for sure. I'd like to see farmers get higher prices. I'd like to see processors make more money, but we shouldn't kid ourselves either. There is no problem of supply right now. But RCN prices continue to hold. That's on costs, and freight costs and other costs have impacted shippers, have impacted exporters, have impacted the intermediaries in the international sector. Even insurance costs have gone higher. Holders are strong, so they're mostly larger companies, well-financed international companies. They have the ability to hold. Do they want to hold? Well, maybe they do for now. They certainly want to recover their costs. That may change as the year goes on. Buyers remain patient, but they can only remain patient for so long. So if we look at that figure for Vietnam, 3.7 months stock, that needs to be replenished. Probably exports will pick up a little bit in June and July. That certainly needs to be replenished, and it takes, it might sound a long time, 4 months, but if you want to buy today in West Africa and have that product in your factory for processing, you need to allow at least 2 months for that to happen. And that's means that what looks like a really healthy inventory is probably just adequate. And finally, quick word on demand. Demand is steady enough, but still questions on the economic impact of higher oil prices. So we are seeing higher inflation this year, particularly in Western countries. We are seeing constraints on consumers in India. We are seeing an impact in China. it tends to hit very quickly. I mean, if you think of pricing, prices for, if you take the example in Europe, prices for energy tend to go up very quickly, but they tend to come down much more slowly. And that's just the nature of the supply chain. People often think it's profiteering. The analysis says it probably isn't profiteering. It's actually just the way a globalized supply chain works. So I think that there is an economic impact of this war that will continue. I'm not alone in thinking that. Many proper economists think the same. And I think it will have an impact on cashew demand in the course of this year. So that's the market. That's a quick view on the market. I'm going to dig now into demand. We're going to have a look at demand trends. We're going to have a look at the long-term trends in demand. But before doing that, I want to just remind you of this idea that cashews, or the cashew sector, is at the crossroads. And this was the idea that production is rising faster than consumption. You've seen this before if you were with us a couple of sessions ago, but I wanted to recap it just to introduce the subject of demand and the importance of supporting stronger demand in the future. So if you take the trend in production up to 2025, and if you forecast that forward, and this is just relatively simple forecast. So what it does is it forecasts the trend and asks, what if this trend continues? We then have a look at the age of the trees, and we say, is there a major impact of aging trees? As you know, cashew trees lose a certain amount of their productivity after year 25. Some say later, but we took 25 as the benchmark for that. And then we looked at the impact of that and the impact of changing habits. Now, we didn't look at climate change. We didn't look at changes in the weather. So this doesn't take any of those factors into account. But it does mean that we're going to see much higher production in the future. And I think this is almost certain. It's almost certain because those trees are in the ground. Those farmers are dependent on those trees, and they will harvest that crop. So if we look at our forecast, it's about 7 million tons by 2030. That's conservative because this year could hit 6 million. But if you look at official forecasts from governments and other agencies, that number is 7.6 million tons, about 10% higher. It's significantly higher. And that means by 2035, to put this in perspective, production will increase more than the total import of the European Union, the United States, and China put together in 2025. That is a massive increase in production over the coming 9 or 10 years. What would it mean for the supply and demand balance? Well, if we look at it, it means a significant surplus starts to emerge. It has already started to emerge. It comes and goes, but by 2030, based on these figures, even a poor crop, even a crop where we had maybe like 2023 or 2024, we had poor weather, a poor crop would create a surplus situation. And by 2035, if we look at this gap, so that triangle shows the balance between supply and demand and how it grows over the period. The impact of that would probably be, inevitably, the impact of that would be lower farm gate prices. Just going to adjust that a little bit because it should look a little bit more like that. So this emerging surplus situation leaves us with alternatives. So on the one hand, can we, or should we, try to reduce production? Doesn't seem like a great idea. Probably penalizes the weakest members of the cashew sector, the growers, and probably is impossible to do anyway, except by crashing prices at the farm gate, which is in nobody's interest. The other option is to increase demand. And that's more possible, more likely to be achieved, but it's not easy. So having a look at this, just to summarize what was quite a long webinar a couple of sessions ago, production is growing quickly. The tree age and climate change, for now at least, will not stop it, bearing in mind more areas will become suitable to grow cashews in West Africa due to climate change. That demand trends will take time to pick up, and therefore surplus production is inevitable. And the realities, well, every cashew country is promoting an increase in production. Every cashew country thinks it would be a good idea to grow more cashews. Our raw cashew nut trade and infrastructure is underpowered. It struggles today to manage 5.5, 6 million tons. How will it manage 8 million tons? Answer is it won't. So it's underpowered. The trading companies are investing opportunistically. So despite the advances in processing in West Africa, it is primarily owned by companies that would be described as trading companies rather than food businesses or long-term food manufacturers. And that creates an opportunistic culture that would probably see the answer to the problem as lower farm gate prices rather than increased demand. And we've no generic promotion of consumption on cashews. There's not even a world body where we can discuss cashews together at this time. All right, that's the context of the discussion. That's the context of the continuing growth in production, contrary to the trend of demand. So let's have a look at that demand and let's explore some of the issues around it. So we'll have a look and we'll call this section the cashew kernel's demand dynamics. In other words, what makes this demand machine run? First of all, let's have a quick look who consumes cashew nuts. And you can see India is the leader, 33% of world consumption, followed by Western Europe, or Western Europe and Eastern Europe together, about 21%. North America, 16%. This is basis 2025. China, 14%. And significant consumers in West Asia and small consumers in other parts of Asia and Oceania. If we look at this, we see that the producing countries, mainly in Africa, but also Cambodia, Vietnam, but apart from India, the producing countries consume less than 1% of the cashews in the world. So there's got to be a question there, can consumption in those countries be boosted? The Indian market is not a market for kernels. The Indian market is a market for raw cashew nuts. It is protected by very high import duties on the import of cashew kernels, effectively closing that market. So if we look at the split overall, there's some variations here on rounding, but so China shows up as 15% here and 14% there. That's just on the rounding of the numbers. If we look then at consumption, India 33%, the US is 14%, Europe, I call it EU 28, that's European Union plus the UK, is around about 19%. So it is quite concentrated, and it is primarily a market for kernels, but 33% of consumption from a producer's point of view is a market for raw cashew nuts, and that's India with its imports of 1.1, 1.2 million tons every year. If we look at the trade channels, so who dominates? Well, Vietnam dominates, as we know. Vietnam has an 89% share of the North American market, a 74% share of the European market, 92% of the Chinese market at the moment. Africa is rising, now 7% of the US market, though that's been growing very slowly. 21% of the European Union market, that's been growing quite quickly. So that's a different trend. It's a much more positive trend. But still, Africa is only really beginning its processing journey. And if we think about the concentration of processing, 2 out of every 3 nuts processed in Africa are processed in Cote d'Ivoire. If we think about that, there's a certain amount of concerns there too. So Vietnam dominates the trade channels. Africa, especially Cote d'Ivoire, is secondary. India is very much closed to the rest of the world, though India does have some small volume of exports to specialist markets. However, it's lost those markets and continues to lose those markets, mainly to Vietnamese suppliers, but also to some African suppliers. So let's have a look at consumption and population. I think this is interesting. I've never looked at this before. We had a quick look over the last few days at population. So here's populations in the key regions. So 548 million North America, 550 million in Europe, 1.5 billion in Africa, 400 million in Central Asia, the Middle East, 1.31 India, 1.38 in China. Now, if the arrow is black, it means that the growth, it means there isn't any, it's static. It means population is not increasing or actually decreasing. If we look in the green, that means population is growing, and the red means population growth is falling. So the population of Europe is falling, the population of North America is falling, the population of India and China is relatively static. That might surprise you, but India, for example, is growing very slowly. Population growth in India is 0.89% per annum. China is shrinking at 0.24% per annum. Interesting figures, and not what you would have expected, certainly not what you would have expected 10 years ago. So let's see that's population. Where are the cashews eat? So in the West, 13% of the world's population consumes 37% of the world's cashews, and that population is falling. If we look at China, 17% of the world's population consumes 14% of the world's cashew kernels. That would encourage you to believe that there's an increase in consumption in China possible. India, 16% of the world's population, and Indian consumers consume 33% of the world's cashews. So when we look at this, what we see is that 43% of the world's population consumes about 84% of the cashews in these 3 major regions, but 84% of the world's cashews are consumed in regions where population is static or falling. So that means our long-term assumptions that consumption of cashews would be driven by increasing population, well, they're gone. Forget about it, because where population is increasing, consumption of this product is relatively low. It's the countries that already have a large population, often the case where that's falling, that are consuming the cashews. And that's linked, of course, to income and wealth. So let's have a look at that. So here's a global map. And you can see the key, but basically blue means income is rising, and other colors of various levels mean income is rising, either more slowly or actually falling. And when we look at this, we see that if we take North America and Europe, about 40% of the world's cashews are consumed in countries where the wealth is either static or falling. One of the interesting things here is that there's a greater concentration of wealth amongst a few people. On the other hand, about 40%, nearly half of the world's cashews are consumed in countries where wealth is growing, mainly India, China, and other parts of Asia, and where the wealth is growing quickly. So you can see in China, it's 4 to 6%. In India, it's growing at above 5.9%. So what we can say here that there is a shift in the consumption of cashew kernels from the West to the East. If we'd looked at these numbers 20 years ago, we would have seen overwhelming dominance of the United States, much lower consumption in India, virtually no consumption in China, even much lower consumption in Europe. But one thing hasn't changed. Consumption in Africa, consumption in countries other than India that produce cashews has not increased. And that seems to be a trend. So what we can draw from this is that the cashews, which was once the preserve of the wealthy, has definitely spread across a greater range of countries, but not yet to the lower income countries, not yet to the poorer countries. Cashews was once the preserve of wealthy countries. That's no longer the case, but it also tends to put a limit on the growth potential. So we've got two things that we assumed for many years were driving the increase in demand in cashews. Increase in population, particularly in India, but also elsewhere, and increasing affluence, particularly in countries that had started at lower incomes. Now we're beginning to see a different dynamic. We're seeing that the chances of consumption growing simply due to population or to greater affluence are declining. Maybe we need to do something about that. So let's have a look at these long-term trends. And what we see is, first of all, if we look at the growth in world consumption of cashews from 2010 through to our estimate of 2026, we would see 6% annual growth. If we look at that for a shorter period, 2016 to 2025, the last 10 years, we see that that figure has fallen to 4.6%. So it certainly is impacted by slowing growth. It's impacted by economic conditions and a whole range of crises, from COVID to the Russian war on Ukraine to the most recent crisis in the Gulf. And if we look at growth rates, what we start to see is volatility. So we're seeing very high growth, very low growth. We're seeing contraction in some years. Consumption has grown based on population, affluence, and on consumer trends. But that can no longer be assumed. Growth is becoming much more volatile. It's becoming more linked to economic conditions. It's becoming more linked to prices. We cannot assume that the consumption of cashews will continue in the future as it has grown in the past. That's a key factor when we look at demand, and particularly when we relate that demand back to production. We now need to look much more at prices, at the economic conditions, and particularly at costs. So let's have a look at some of the growth trends in different markets. So if we look at the 10-year period, what we're seeing is that markets like India have grown steadily, about 3.8%. Europe, pretty strong growth, and this is based on trends. Very strong growth in recent years in China and in the Middle East. But the United States market has grown very slowly. And that's not just about 2025. It's not just about import tariffs. That figure would only be 1% if we took out 2025. So we've got to ask certain things. If we look in India, let's say that consumption growth is driven by affluence, a greater taste for tree nuts, but not by population any longer. If we look in Europe, we've got to ask the question that how long will healthy eating trends affect European imports? If the population isn't growing and people change their habits, they can only change them once. You can't become more and more healthy by eating more and more cashew nuts. You might make changes, you stick with those changes. And the other question then is, when we look at China, the fastest growing market in recent years, and we have to ask, would Chinese buyers buy cashews if almonds from the United States or pistachios from the United States were not subject to import tariffs. In other words, if prices were lower. We don't know the answer to that question, but it seems no coincidence that the introduction of import tariffs from US products coincided with this very strong growth in the consumption of cashews. You know, a lot of the argument that comes across when we talk about demand is that this just happened. I mean, we did not make it happen in this industry. It just happened. Cashews got more consumption in Europe because almonds were promoted. Healthy tree nuts were promoted. Cashews fit that trend. Cashew consumption in China grew because of higher costs for imported raw nuts from the United States. So when we look at this overall situation, it's not that healthy and it is volatile. We cannot assume the growth in demand, particularly if we look at our two fastest growing markets. So if we look at this, so this shows growth rates year by year for all the major markets. And, you know, don't look at it in detail, at least not now. But what it shows is volatile growth. Some years it's fantastic growth, other years contraction. But if we look at our two fastest growing markets, the Middle East or West Asia more correctly, and China, we see huge volatility there. And we also see a note, particularly for China, that it is as likely that demand will fall in certain years as it will grow. So we've seen 3 years of tremendous growth. But prior to that, we saw 3 years of low growth or no growth. And that pattern is repeated over the last 15 years or so. What's most worrying, I think, looking at these numbers, is that the fastest growing markets are also the most volatile markets. And that's got to be a concern. So let's have a quick look at some of those markets and what drives them. In Europe, it's change of habit, it's diversification, it's sustainability, it's health, it's snacking. In China, key factors, import tariffs, as I've mentioned, value for money, snacking. In India, well, cashews are part of Indian food culture. Affluence and the economy are most important factors, but it's not growing at the pace that it was growing. There's also more competition for other nuts in a normal year. In Africa, 1.5 billion people, we don't really know. We don't really know what the growth is. We do know it's low. We do know that African consumers are not that interested in cashews, partly because of the cost, but also because that type of consumption hasn't really arisen. And we also know the United States, for many, many years, the world's largest consumer, long ago overtaken by India, but that it is volatile and growth rates are relatively slow. In fact, if we look at the markets, what we see is that only China shows any signs of growing at a rate that will meet production increase. And that's got to be of some concern. Quick look of drivers of demand. And what I'm looking for when I look at this is what are the things that are driving demand that can continue? So if we start in Europe, convenience, healthy snacking, tastes and textures, healthy eating, this has had its moment perhaps. It can't keep driving on forever. Maybe Europeans will buy more African cashews than they have in the past. I think that's probably certain. But is it likely that they'll return to very fast growth? Well, in Eastern Europe, we'll see relatively fast growth. But in Western Europe, I think that's unlikely. Similarly, in the United States, the market is a big consumer of cashew nuts. It's got to a point where the primary driver is the economy. If economic conditions are good, production will go up, our consumption will go up. If not, it'll flatten out. China, we've talked about convenience, healthy eating, alternatives. So if other nuts are available, maybe cashew growth will not be as big as it has been in the last few years. India, highly interesting, of course. Will India return to fast growth? You know, last February 2025, that is, In India, I thought, yeah, India is due to absolutely explode on the consumption of tree nuts. I'm not so sure now. The impact of this last 2.5 months, the weaker rupee, the fact that India imports 60% of its cashews really starts to make me ask question marks on this. And I suppose what we're seeing is the fragility of fast growth in India. Will it grow? Of course it'll grow. Will it grow at the rates we saw 10 years ago, 6% plus? Seems unlikely now. And in West Asia, we see, again, 9% of the world's consumption, possibility for growth, but again, economic conditions. So we're looking at areas where we're not seeing the traditional drivers of cashew consumption at the same level that we saw in the past. Increasing population, increasing affluence, especially in developing countries. It's not happening. It's not been happening. It's not going to happen. And that means we need to look at new ways to build the consumption of cashews. And we're not alone in doing that. If we look at the import markets, based on a 2024, which is the last complete number I had, cashews had only a 12% share of imports. If we look in India, cashews, 33% of the consumption is cashews. It's very strong. It's the leading nut, but it's already well saturated. Almonds, pistachios, walnuts all compete. If we look in Middle East, West Asia, again, almonds, pistachio, walnuts. Pistachio are growing very quickly. There is significant competition. We won't talk about US imports. Cashews are important, but don't forget the US produces most of its own tree nuts. But Europe is interesting. So in Europe, if we look at imports, almonds lead the way. Big time. Almonds, hazelnuts, pistachio, walnuts are all ahead of cashews. There is major competition. There is major competition for market share, and we're looking at, for example, American tree nuts, very sophisticated marketing. There's sophisticated marketing of almonds, pistachio, to a certain extent, walnuts, less so for hazelnuts, but it is there. But for cashews, there's virtually none. And that means competition. And it's not on price, because if we look for the same period, if we look at the price, cashews are rarely, if ever, the cheapest nut. Cashews are generally more expensive than almonds. They're a little bit cheaper than pistachio, usually, but they're also quite volatile. So we're not going to compete solely on price, but we have built this business over the last 15 years on lower prices, on so-called affordable cashews. How did that situation come about? Well, I think it came about because of the success of Vietnam. So Vietnam, faced with a situation where its production was static, in fact, it was contracting at that time, it had to figure out a way to be more competitive, to be more successful, and it's done so brilliantly. Good management, better technology, and larger scale means that Vietnam has been able to become bigger. It's been able to become better at managing rising costs, and it has somehow managed to bridge that gap between a distant raw material, importing 89% of its raw material, most of that from Africa, at least 2/3 from Africa. It's managed to do that. It's managed to bridge that cost brilliantly by being highly competitive in processing. But it was helped by outside factors. It was helped by India's withdrawal from the world market about 15 years ago. It was helped by the slow development of processing in Africa. We know that the first 2 generations of technology for processing in Africa failed. We know that the semi-manual model failed. We know that the first generation of semi-mechanized also failed. It's running now, but it's taken a long time. We know that the opportunistic trading of raw cashew nuts in the international market was a key factor in helping the Vietnamese sector to grow, access to material, not having to build their own supply chains, being able to plug into major trading partners. And also it was helped by the focus, initially driven from the United States, but also driven from Europe later, this idea on affordable cashew nuts. Cashew nuts are not cheap. They've never been cheap. But affordable cashew nuts means that the price will be a little bit lower. How do you achieve a lower price for a relatively high-priced product? Well, let's talk about that in a minute. But this Vietnamese model helped to boost consumption. It also helped to drop prices. Is it still fit for purpose? How did it come about? Well, it's based on top technology, in fact, inventing the technology and then agreeing to supply it to everyone else too. Large scale, always available RCN, monthly imports, monthly arrivals, weekly arrivals. The idea that lower prices will drive demand, which hadn't previously been a factor, but came in the last 15 years or so, by essentially following the US model, drive the price down, increase consumption, everyone wins. Or do they? So in doing this, higher technology, higher scale meant lower costs, and these gigantic factories, which do a fantastic job, make no mistake. The dependence on imports, yeah, it does help the cash flow because you can pay almost monthly for your raw material, but it creates an import dependence. Now, if you're 89% dependent on imports and costs of freight, insurance, fuel all start to rise, if costs of port operations start to rise, and that's what's happened, and that's what we're seeing now. That's one of the reasons raw cashew nut prices are so high. And then you see the intervention of governments in Africa, export taxes where there were none. 15 years ago, there were, apart from Tanzania, there were no export taxes. There are now, and they're actually getting higher. So generally, highly dependent on imports, and the cost of that is rising. Lower prices, yeah, of course, lower prices drove increases in demand, especially in the US and Europe. But there's other sides to that. What's actually driving demand for cashew nuts in Europe is not price. It is a factor, of course, but quality. Now people are asking about sustainability. Big driver is the changing consumer preferences, the focus on healthy snacks, for example. The perception that tree nuts are very healthy. We didn't make that in the cashew business. That was made in other tree nuts, especially American tree nuts, but we benefited by it. So lower price will drive demand, but there's other factors too, and those have to be considered. It's not just about price. But the big problem, if you follow the model that lower price will drive demand, because why? Because 15 years ago, the United States was the biggest market in the world. That's no longer the case. It's actually the slowest growing of the major markets now. And it's the most price sensitive. So you have a model that's based on supplying affordable cashews to consumers that will buy more because the prices are low. But that's not actually the case anymore. What we are seeing is the import dependence. Well, one way to manage import dependence is to encourage other producers. So what's happened is that in order to manage this situation where margins come under pressure, reduce the quality. And that's happened. And it's happened in several ways. One of the ways is to develop bespoke grades, ship lower quality, therefore you can ship it at a lower price. Therefore you see stratification in the market. If you look at any quotation from a processor, from a broker in Vietnam today, you'll see China quality, EU quality, Middle East quality, and so on. encourage Cambodian production so that you now, and this has worked out very well so far, 1 million tons available on the doorstep of Vietnam. But what will happen if Cambodia develops its own processing, as I think it probably will? Other solutions, Burma kernels. So do part of the process abroad, ship less volume, leave the byproducts problem back in Africa. And the final idea, influence Africa, which failed. The efforts to influence policy in Africa has failed. African governments have still continued to go their own way. They've increased export taxes. They've introduced price control at the farm gate. What we were looking at over this period of time was what was often called, it was called decommoditization, but it was actually just decommoditization of the way that this product was talked about, not about the way it was handled or the way that actors in the market behaved. In fact, it's as speculative as ever. It's as price-driven as ever, but it's in trouble. Because nowadays, and this moment in time is a case in point, a profitability crisis for processors in Vietnam, but also elsewhere, is never far away. Margins are low. Margins can be easily wiped out by unexpected spikes in raw material prices or in costs. So when you go to work on build demand based on price, but costs start to rise, you've got to find alternative solutions. And those were to reduce quality, which is not sitting very well with buyers. If you look at the number of complaints about foreign matter, they're going up every day. African governments are not happy with the Burma kernels trade. Some have banned it. Policy in Africa continues to be 60% of the world's cashews grow in African countries. African governments continue to introduce increasing restrictions on the export of raw cashew nuts, support for processing, and higher tax on exports. So there is a problem. This model for driving demand is unlikely to be successful in the future in the way it was in the past. What about the African model? It's a bit different. Africa is more about the story. It's definitely not a commodity. Raw material is no problem, plentiful supply. Vietnamese technology is available to build to scale. Higher costs are covered in the supply chain. If it costs $300 a ton to move a ton of raw cashew nuts to a factory in Vietnam from Ivory Coast, it might only cost $100 within the country. So being close to the supply chain helps to manage the costs. African processors tend to focus on nearby markets. They tend to focus on Europe. That's how the market share in the European Union has risen so quickly. They do match buyers' needs, but they can match them on things like traceability, sustainability, and that's part of having the supply, but it's also part of being located close to the production. And for the most part, and often because they can't, African processors don't compete on price, or at least not on price alone. But Africa, despite the so far success of this model, notably in Côte d'Ivoire, Africa has a problem of growth. Processing is not growing in Ghana. It struggled in Benin. It struggles in Nigeria. Processing is only grown very slowly in East Africa. In fact, one of the difficulties of location, so it's a tremendous advantage to be located close to the European market, but it's also a difficult one because it is the most difficult market. It's got the most exacting standards on things like chemical residues, traceability, sustainability, certification of factories, practice at the farm gate, labor regulations. So African processors, despite their success so far, they have a problem of growth. It is going to be difficult to grow. The level of growth, even in Côte d'Ivoire, will slow. What will happen in Ghana, Nigeria, Tanzania, Benin, Guinea-Bissau in terms of processing remains to be seen. So you have on the one hand a difficult model in Vietnam based on lower cost, lower price, and inevitably lower quality. A model in Africa based on sustainable supply, but quite narrow in the markets it can approach. I mean, for African processors to be competitive in the Middle East or in China is really difficult. When you might say, okay, well, African processors have no import duty in China. That's good. But with cashews, neither does anybody else. Vietnamese processors don't face any import duty. There is VAT, but there's no import duty in China. So what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, first of all, I think we need to recognize cashew demand growth is slowing just as production has increased. Firstly, recognize that. The traditional support of an increasing population for demand can no longer be taken for granted. Recognize that Vietnam dominates, that dominance is on merit, but the lack of diversification of supply, in other words, high dependence on a single country for supply, is definitely seen as a risk factor by some buyers. That's driving some to Africa, particularly Europeans. We see that growing affluence continues to increase consumption, but is volatile. So the two pillars of growth in demand, growing affluence, especially in developing countries, and increasing population, one can't be taken for granted, and the other is increasingly volatile. It cannot be assumed. And the fastest growing markets are also the most volatile in these factors, in the economic and affluence aspects. So we look for a much more volatile period ahead. The drivers of demand vary from health and sustainability in Europe to price in the United States, to affluence in India, to alternative nuts in China. We need to take that into account. And we need to realize that the Vietnamese model may be under pressure. Now, I think in Vietnam, that's well realized. Margins are tight, options are sought. And we need to understand that the African model, as it stands, is limited. It either needs greater support, better funding. It certainly needs better marketing. And it needs a better story to be told. People need to be aware of it. It's a very narrow focus at the moment. If we looked at the number of customers, yes, we see the increase in export of cashew kernels from African countries, but if we look at the number of customers, it's highly concentrated. And it's also focused on markets that have limited long-term growth. The European market is growing, but it's not going to grow at this rate, about 6%, for a long time. And even in 2026, it's growing much more slowly, but at least it is growing. My conclusion from this is that we need a new approach. We need a new approach to marketing. We need a new approach to developing our markets. And we can take some lessons from other tree nuts. So if we look at a couple of examples, if we look at what makes the marketing of tree nuts successful, and we look at the marketing of almonds from California for the last 25 years, it's been spectacular. One time, California was looking at shooting up production, declining prices, and static demand. They changed that, and they changed it through really good marketing. And you can see some of the examples on your screen. Focus on the quality of the product, different uses for the product, the health benefits, focusing on the consumer, but also on the importer and also on the food service. Do we do that in cashews? Not at all. Not a bit of it. We generally say, hey, we've got a good product. I can do a good price for you today. That's the way we market. If we look at the example of walnuts, walnuts again from the United States, similar situation. Highly organized, branded products, focus on industry, a reinvention of what a walnut was. So a walnut went from being a dark, rather tasty product to being a light color, much lighter taste product over 20 or 30 years. And that was done, and many people would say that walnuts are not as good, but if you're selling more at a better price, you're probably not concerned about that. And that was done through reliability, good standards of food safety, predictability, good communication, and marketing. And it's not just the United States. It's not just a wealthy country. A country like Georgia was highly successful in turning around its hazelnut industry, identifying competitive advantages, selecting target markets, being well organized, having a focus on the full supply chain. So it can be done in a less well-off country too, just having the right approach. So what do these countries have in common? What do successful tree nut marketing countries have in common? And I'd put it down to a number of factors. Generic promotion of the product. We don't do that in cashews, but everyone promoting almonds or walnuts or hazelnuts, as opposed to just promoting our own product. A good support from governments. US government, Georgian government, there are several other examples. Good vision, good support, good information has helped. Looking at the constraints, meeting buyers' requirements. So if we need BRC, how do we make sure all of our factories have it? If we have a problem of reliability, if we get a lot of contract defaults, how do we address that? How do we keep our quality, our food safety up? How do we keep maximum residue levels from chemicals under control? How do we develop certified supply chains? Strong organization and cohesion is a feature in all of those countries. It's present throughout, and there is a global aspect to that in hazelnuts, in almonds. We don't have it in cashews, or we don't have it yet. Well, perhaps we need it if we're going to increase the consumption of this product. And finally, the investment in people and technology. And maybe that does happen more in cashews than it used to. So what we're looking at is, when we look at demand, we're looking at a situation where we can no longer assume that demand will grow at the fast rates that we've seen in recent years. We can no longer just represent our own national interests, our business interests in promoting demand. We need to do something different, because if we don't, the level of production growth is going to exceed the level of demand growth. And in the long term, that will cause prices to fall and cause this industry to get less profitable, less economically viable, right from the farm gate all the way through to the supermarket. Are we doing anything about this now? No, there's virtually nothing happened. National levels, some gesture stuff, go to the odd trade show, but generally speaking, there is no promotion of cashews other than perhaps by individual retailers or retail chains. We definitely have a problem. Now, this is not a problem for this year or next year. This is a problem for the next decade. What we do about it will determine the health of this industry, and particularly the health of the smallholder farmers, the poorest members of our industry, not just in becoming more affluent, but in surviving over the next decade as production grows. Thanks very much to listening. That was me talking about demand. Let me pass you back to Isaac. Isaac, have we got any questions today?
Hello, Jim. Yes, we've got one here. A question on the markets in China. Says China markets continue to grow. What does this mean for the industry? Is it an opportunity to grab and expand further, or a concern of sustainability?
Well, first of all, I don't think we should take for granted that the Chinese market will continue to grow. Let's have a look at, let's see if we can flip back to one of those slides. Yeah, let's go back here. So look at this chart on the right-hand side. So the yellow bars are the annual growth of consumption in China. So yeah, we see 1, 2, 3, the last 3 years up to 2025, strong growth. But before that, we saw actually a decline. Before that, we saw slow growth. So what we see in China is a relatively volatile pattern in growth over a long period of time. So we shouldn't necessarily assume that China will continue to grow its consumption of cashew nuts. It has been very successful in recent years. I don't think that'll continue. I think it will grow, but I don't think it'll continue at the same rate. Is it an opportunity? It is definitely an opportunity. Whether it's an opportunity for African processors is a difficult one, because obviously that's a very distant market. Obviously, it seems to me that there is an opportunity for African processors, but it will take a very careful approach. What will make Chinese buyers more interested in African cashew kernels? Will it be quality, perhaps? Will it be the development of new products? Will it be offering consumer goods? Big questions. So yeah, it's an opportunity. I'm not sure whether it's an opportunity for African processors or just for the sale of more African raw cashew nuts. Isaac. Isaac, I think you're muted.
Yes, apologies. As Swani says, the only option of increasing demand now is Africa. Start teaching them and promoting. Indian staple sweets can be made from lower grades, solving the affordability issues. What do you say?
African people know pretty much what they want to eat. They know what they like. They have their own opinions on that. They don't need Indian style sweets. I do think we need to develop consumption in African countries by coming up with products that are more affordable. I would agree with that. I think, though, that the assumption that affordability is the only issue, affordability is an issue, but it's not the only issue. Awareness is an issue. I mean, there's no real long-term culture of consuming cashew nuts in African countries. People should be made aware of the benefits of that. There should be affordable products available. That may need some form of state subsidization. It certainly needs promotion. But I think people are quite capable of working out for themselves what kind of products they will use. But the entrepreneurs that are going to supply those products need to be supported to do so. I think that's really important. But I don't think we should look. The days of imposing solutions on other countries are gone. If Indian sweets were available in African countries, I don't necessarily think that they would be readily sold. I don't necessarily think that even if they were very low priced, they would be readily sold. People have their own tastes and habits, and I don't think that they could be imposed. But the moments, the ways of developing that consumption should certainly be explored. What else, Isaac? Anything else?
Yes, we have.
It's an interesting comment, though, isn't it? Because it
yes,
does get
very
you
interesting. Very interesting. We have a few more. Which platform will be more better to promote cashews or market them for an individual factory? Is it by food exhibitions or physical meeting with current importers, or which is the best model of marketing cashews well?
I think that the best model of marketing cashews is, first of all, identify what your target market is. Get yourself in a position where you can meet those buyers' requirements. So let's say you decide, I want to sell to the European market, which if you were in West Africa, that'd be a pretty good decision. Then get yourself in a position where, can I meet the European buyers' requirements? Do I have a good food safety certification? Is my product suitable? Can I market the whole grades and the brokens? I'm definitely going to break some cashews in the process. Have I got a market for those? How do I tell my story? Am I linked to my supply chain? Can I start to talk about our farmers? Can I talk about our way of buying, our way of processing? Do I treat my workers in my factory well? Do I treat the farmers that supply me fairly? All of these things are factors. Now you're in a position, if you have all or most of those things, you're in a position where you could start thinking about supplying that market. Once you're in that position, how do you tell your story? Well, first of all, have a story. Present it well. Present it online. Present it honestly, coherently. Don't try to tell people you're something that you're not. I think that food exhibitions or trade shows have a part to play, but I think really it's great for learning. It's great for meeting existing customers. I'm not sure how cost effective it is in developing markets for businesses that are already well positioned. So if you've got a portfolio of customers, you can go to a trade show. You're going to spend a lot of money, by the way, doing that. Or somebody's going to spend a lot of money doing that. What are you going to find out? You could learn, but I find in trade shows, and I've been to a lot of them, and I've taken a lot of groups of processors to trade shows over the years, to Anuga, to Sial, IFE, Fancy Food, Sial India, you name it. Did processors learn a lot? For sure. Did they do a lot of new business? Not so sure. Did they meet a lot of people? Yes. Did they meet a lot of people that they sold to in the future? Probably no. So it depends on your business. If you're well-established, trade shows are effective. If you just want to learn, they're effective. But if you're early stage, they're less effective. You will spend a lot of money and waste a lot of time. Why are they so popular? Well, they're so popular because it's the principle of OPM, other people's money. So if the government or if a development organization is happy to pay for you to go, well, why not go? But if you were spending, ask yourself, if I was spending my own money, would I do it? And if your answer is no, then don't do it anyway. Concentrate on direct communication with customers. Go to see them, always effective. Invite them to come and see you, always effective too. They are prepared to listen, especially Europeans right now, but also buyers in the Middle East. They're prepared to listen. Some US, but again, in the US, it's going to be, for most buyers, it's going to be focused on price. So what makes your product sell? Can you sell it simply because you're cheap? Probably not. Can you sell it because you make a great product and it's certified and you tell a good story that's linked to your supply chain? Yeah, I think that's likely to work for African suppliers. So I think carefully about this. I would think very carefully about it. And I would emphasize direct communication with buyers over participation in trade shows once you're getting developed in your business. At the early stage, go to a trade show, you learn a lot. That's a good question. It's a really interesting one. And it's the kind of question that we talk about in some of the business coaching that we do. And it's a big question, of course. Isaac, back to you.
Yes, we have another question here. Will slow immigration growth in the United States cause the growth of cashew consumption in the US, especially due to competition from other nuts?
Immigration has nothing to do with cashew consumption, first of all, in the United States or elsewhere. There's some unusual assumption in that question. Answer the second part of the question. Will there be more competition from other nuts? Well, there will be, but at the same time, the production of US almonds is primarily export oriented. There is a big domestic market, but it does go export. The pistachios are definitely causing an impact on cashew demand. So I don't know what slow immigration growth, what that's linked to cashew consumption at all. I have no clue on that question. But there will be greater consumption from other tree nuts in the future. But at the same time, There are problems in California with the use of water, and the use of water may cause something of a crisis in tree nut production in California, which is where the almonds and the pistachios come from. And that might create an opportunity for cashew nuts in the future. Isaac.
Okay. One more question. Policy changes. How will policy changes in the European Union market, especially our example UEDR, affect kernel exporters or kernel export to the EU next season?
Okay, so if we're talking about kernel exports, the volume, not at all. If we're talking about the exporter, probably not at all next year. But in the coming years, it will place certain processors in a better position because they will be in a better position to meet the requirements. I don't think that in the short term, this is going to have any impact at all, but it may well cause consumers to be more focused. It might boost trade from Africa if consumers become more aware of this. But I think that there are a lot more issues to be addressed before they get to impacting on the import of cashews. I think we need to focus on basics. We need to focus on how we tell our story, how we market our product, what our product is. That's much more important at this moment in time than focusing on the technicalities. Growth, as we assumed for 40 years, growth in consumption is not guaranteed anymore. And that's the factor we need to focus on. Isaac.
Okay, that is all in terms of questions from our participants. Thanks to all those who have sent in these questions and comments. Jim will be back next month on the 15th of July, 2026. What do we expect between now and then?
That's the plan. We are going to talk about, I'm thinking I will have a review of the West African cashew season on the 15th of July. By then, we're almost at the end of everything in West Africa. Let's have a look back, see how it went. And that's the idea. Thanks everyone today for joining us. Thanks very much for those questions. Some of those were really interesting. I look forward to seeing you in July. Thanks, Isaac. Thanks everyone at ACA. And see you in 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you very much, Jim, for the presentation and for taking time to answer some of the very interesting questions we've had. Before we go, dear participants, remember that online registration for the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo from the 15th to the 18th of September 2026 is currently ongoing. Register now and enjoy up to 40% discount on all conference rates. Before we go, we also want to acknowledge the support of our sponsors, the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew, the Cashew Club, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Thank you all for participating in today's session. See you on the 15th of July, 2026. Until then, bye-bye.
Recording stopped.